So I'm going to take notes of things that I ask that are important. And the first thing that I asked was, what is the first thing when you were your own independent organism, like Karren was Karren for the very first time, what was the first orientation that your very little self made when you were brand new?
So you're not referring to in my memory, you're just referring to my knowledge of what I would have oriented to.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, one of the things I want to talk about is like the voice of our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the sum of all the lessons learned in all the hundreds of millions of generations of, maybe more, billions of generations of, probably even more, for all of life, all the way back.
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds, millions, or trillions of generations of ancestors that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the way, especially with mammals, but really for all complicated life, what is the very first thing that taught you what was up and down?
Well, I mean, there's instinct and there's conscious thought, isn't there? Because something told me to be upside down in my mum's belly.
Sure. So let's take it back a little further. Let's take it back the very moment of conception. So your fertilized egg falling through the fallopian tubes as a single cell, right? Everything that you are in terms of information, minus environment, was contained in one cell right then. You're falling through the fallopian tube. If the egg encounters the uterine lining, that's the very first moment of orientation. Where's mother, right? That becomes the connection. Literally, that is like biologically, that is where you say, okay, this is now up, this is now down. You end up with some of the early cell proliferation, but it's oriented around where is the uterus, where is mom, where are the nutrients coming from? Blastocyst and blastocele from that period, right?
Mm-hmm.
The very first orientation that you have in the universe is where is mother. And if you skip forward to where we are now, if you're alive and you're a mammal, you had a mom. And in fact,
mm-hmm.
up until recently, before,
or had a mum, yeah.
Yeah. Before infant formula, like you for sure had a mom, because you die as a mammal without milk, right? Babies can't eat anything but milk at the beginning. So if you're alive, you definitely had a mother. And I think that that's where we should start. So
mm-hmm.
in our original, in our like most common setting, so where humans spent most of their time, the last 10,000 years have been a little weird, but the 200,000 years total that we've been anatomically modern, so this only represents like 5% of our time. The other 95% of being human, and this comes from a good summary by Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein, we were surrounded by family and friends. The human tribe, that is the setting. It's family and friends. And again, because humans, really, we can't live alone. Like we were never meant to be alone. Like I told you before, I'll say it again for the purpose of the recording. But alone for a human, you have to sleep, right? And if you're in a jungle, you get gobbled up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you don't have tools to make a wall or a fence or something protective. Like at some point, if you're alone, you're done. We were never meant to be that way, which explains why we're so afraid to be alone today. And if nothing else, It's weird to say, but I do believe you're incomplete as an individual. It's not like, we don't say that very often in like self-help universes, but you can't reproduce alone, right? You're a dead end. Even if you do manage to not get gobbled up and not get hurt, when you break a leg, you're done, right? Only in a tribe are you supported enough for that not to be the end of you. Okay. So I want to write, let's see. Are you able to see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Start here. So I believe that the first, and we'll bounce around a little bit between our genetic, I guess the genetic voices, right? So the voices of all of our ancestors, in essence, sharing in code, our genetic code, the things that worked for them. May not have been perfect, but they worked long enough for every one of our ancestors to successfully reproduce. Every one of your ancestors successfully reproduced, all the way back through the early hominids, back through early mammals, back through fish, one of our great, however many greats, early jawed fishes. They had a complement that worked, and they gave it to their kids. A couple tweaks, like, hey, try this. This might work, right? Some amount of variation that was considered, well, it's not really considered, but even the variation and the pace of variation worked for our ancestors. So I think when you start the first scan, so this is just where you are. This is like B. And the first scan is going to be, and I want to talk about modern humans now, because that's kind of what our experience is grounded in, right? We have mother and father. Situate yourself, find the mother. If there's a mother, there's probably a father, right? Now, whether the father's still there or whether you have, because we're a pro-social species, you can actually have kind of multiple mothers and multiple fathers. But if you're alive, you had at least a mother and a father at one point. So I think this is where you have to start realizing that your, from over here, where's my other notes? I wrote some of this part down. Okay. I think broadly, I want to make the case that your ancestors speak to you through instinct and intuition for how to behave in any environment. Because it's not always clear where you're going to end up. And I'm sure our ancestors ended up in all sorts of terrible situations, right? But we're adaptable enough to survive. If you think about even in recorded history, how many different weird situations our ancestors had to be flexible enough to survive. Speaks to like adaptability being selected for overall, right? And trusting in the power of that instinct and intuition that you will know what to do. Is my camera upside down to you?
No, it's perfect.
Cool. So if we go back to like our human society, like 30,000 years ago or 80,000 years ago, and we assume that they're much like our closest ancestors are today, like bonobo chimpanzees, right? Close tribe, family, friends. Other primates also have priorities of support, including siblings. Brothers and sisters are, they exist in chimpanzee troops. They exist in pygmy chimps, bonobos, right? So like a mother, like a father, we have sister, we have brother. when you have a baby, they don't, the Blank Slate book discusses how we have some broad categories that we fill in with experience. So this is the nurture nature point and counterpoint. But when you're trying to figure out what is what, at the very beginning, I believe that there's probably a spot to identify which is mother and a spot to identify which is father. Like, out of the things that appear to be actors or agents, eventually you figure out that you are too. But I don't even know if that's it's not clear to infants probably, but they can see intention in other creatures. I think that we have subsystems of our brains that are looking for pattern. I mean, this is actually demonstrated, right? So you have pattern recognizing subsystems in your brain that are always scanning for straight lines. And they're always looking to identify shadows to estimate size and shape, right? Which is why optical illusions work, is because you can trick the subsystems because they're not that clever, right? And so as they're filtering signal and they're like, okay, this is a line, this is a line. I think one of the very first thresholds that the pattern recognition has to pass through is determine whether there is an agent involved. Like, is there something that is capable of action and has discernible intention? There's some other research that talks about this as being probable reasons for humans becoming animists, like impugning action and intention to things like the wind or the earth or the forest, right? If you're constantly looking, it's safer. Where is this from? Which book is this from? I think it's from some Richard Dawkins, maybe Unweaving the Rainbow. It's simply safer to assume that the rustle in the bushes on the African savanna might be a lion than it is to assume that it is not a lion, right? Clearly makes us an anxious species, but also makes us look for agents where there may not be agents. Because I think if that's the math that one has to do very initially, right? Like, if you're a baby and you're just born, one of the very first things that they learn to look for, it's actually they know to look for, is eyes. They look for eyes, look for mother's eyes. Right? They'll gaze into eyes. Mothers will gaze right back, right? And among the pattern recognizers that we have, we also look for circles. We look for faces, right? We have dedicated subsystems for these to recognize these things. Snakes, like snake shapes, will startle us because that part of the brain thinks that there may be a snake, so it fires, signals an alert. You would actually probably know. That would be interesting. That reflex, where does it get initiated? Like, because it's not a motor reflex like a spinal reflex. That would have to come, but I wonder if it processes. I wonder if it comes from like the visual processing.
It bypasses the brain. I think it's just this spinal reflex. It's like a hot stove reflex. It doesn't go up to your brain.
But it would have to interact because it's if you see something, right?
That's
so it's
true.
got to go, it has to be primarily visually processed. I bet it gets initiated there. I'll bet it's a primary visual process initiated motor reflex, if it's considered a reflex when it originates in the brain, that then gets secondarily checked. I'll bet that's, we could look into that. That would be neat. So it's like, but when you're scanning, so the first thing is like, okay, you exist, good job. If you exist, you have a mother because you're a mammal. Scan, find the mother, find the father, look for an agent. Like, so this would be just how the brain functions all the time, is trying to find which ones are the agents. I think it's something along the lines of like, does it have eyes? And does it move? You can do some really interesting thought experiments where you talk about humans that can't move. And then we apply a whole different set of moral standards to humans that can't move. Sam Harris, in one of his books, he talks about the moral landscape. He talks about how when you think it's dark. I don't know if I'll put this in the final recording, but with torture, with regards to torture, it's like torturing a human, most of us recoil against, right? Like we have a visceral reaction if, you're torturing and they're screaming or whatever. But he said, what if we had a terrorist who, because that was kind of like the era that he wrote in, a terrorist who knew where a bomb was about to go off and it's going to go off in an hour. They know where it is. What would you be willing to do? And that puts the mind a little differently. And then he said, what if instead of it being jumper cables and a battery, what if you could just give them a pill? And the pill would put them through the most excruciating pain imaginable, but it would also completely paralyze them. There would be no reaction. You would see no reaction to it. You'd administer the pill. 10 minutes later, they'd be willing to do whatever you wanted. Do you apply a different moral rubric against that situation? Right? And almost everybody does. Like, oh, if they don't move, well, then let's apply a whole different set of rules, right? So clearly that's part of it. And that's one of the things that makes it an agent, right? So if it has eyes and it moves, then we categorize it, right? And this is kind of like where I think it all starts. Because if we consider a nation an agent, we're like, okay, it's an agent. Apply that original super old, pattern of categorization, and then essentially, like, we'll get there. We're not there yet. But think about that, right? What if you were to apply this agent idea to broad concepts, like your insurance company? Like, pretend that they are literally an agent and they have discernible intentions and they can take action in the world. I think that might be actually the next part. Like, if it has agency, you would want to know its intentions. Humans, because of eye gaze and our ability to determine intention by looking at the eyes of each other. I don't know where this comes from, but none of the other primates have conjunctiva like we do, right? The white scape of our eyes allows us to see where each other is looking, which if we were hostile to each other, you would never want. And the other primates don't have it because it betrays, right? It betrays you. It betrays what you're looking at, where you might be about to bite or grasp or, thrust. But that does allow us to determine intention. We broadcast our intentions because there's some amount of assuming of safety, right? Because we would be surrounded by family and friends. I think that if it doesn't, then we reassess whatever we're thinking about, and it's something more along the lines of, is it a threat? Or is it a resource? It can get dangerous when you move to this, I guess at this point, this bifurcation of conceptualization. Like if you arrive at people and you're just like, okay, I'm not going to see, Martin Buber, a philosopher, talks about this. Was I versus thou? So recognizing the humanity, making sure that when you're dealing with a human, you don't just process them as, are you a threat to me or are you a resource to me? Because if you're a resource, or if you view an object, I don't know, any object, then one would judge it by its utility to you, right? Which is exactly how we frame the world. We frame the world through utility. When I see, I think Jordan Peterson might talk about this, but if you see a chair, we conceptualize the chair based on sitting. Like, what is the chair good for? It's good for sitting upon. We see it as a distinct object by its utility. If you were to put the chair in front of me as I was trying to get to the door, now it becomes an obstacle. It's no longer useful, right? And it's reconceptualized as an obstacle, something to be climbed over, right? The approach that you take to it is different. But the other version, so if it's a threat, then we run different math on it. I think this is any concept, basically, or I don't know exactly yet how the agent, what the boundaries of agent are. That's probably movable, which we need to be careful about, because the if it's a threat, you essentially, it's a threat, you attack it, right? You destroy it.
Or do you run away from it?
That's a good point. That's a very good point. I have notes on fighting, flying, fleeing, or fight, flight, fawn, which makes sense. Freeze and fawn, yeah. Well, so let's suppose that that's let's put a pin in that one. I like that. Threat. Let's not put a, we'll record it here. So fight, flight, flee. I think fawn only applies if it is both a threat and you perceive an agent. So it might be the way it's currently modeled. If you perceive agent, if you scan and perceive agent, then you attempt to type it. Like, what type of thing is it? Is it like a father? Is it like a sister? Is it like a brother? So we'll call this.
I think it's, yeah, I think you need to be looking at this line of things as living things, not objects, because that's where it gets confusing. So agents can be humans, or they can be things that we're putting googly eyes on. And I think it's a different tree for each.
Correct.
And one for humans.
I literally think it might be the googly eyes, which for the recording purposes, we were talking about this earlier. Like, anything that you put googly eyes on, humans will impugn agency to easily, very readily. Every cartoon ever about anything, right? Like, oh, the brave little toaster. It's like, it's a toaster with eyes. Oh, wow. Like, let's tell the story about the toaster. Like, oh, the toaster does things, and it manifests human will, and he's buddies with a vacuum cleaner that is just a vacuum cleaner, but he has eyes. So as soon as and the eyes have to move.
And they move, yeah.
So then we apply all the agent rubric to it, right? And then we'll put fawn here. These are adaptive. So again, with the voiceover,
does the typing that you've written there come between agent and the threat resource split? Is it an agent? Does it have eyes? Does it move? What type is it? And according to what type it is, that's how you know whether it's a threat or a resource.
Yes, but that is a good point. I'm not quite sure where it'll line in here. I'm going to build this out into two other directions based upon whatever we end up describing these things as. So like sister and like brother within your tribe. So we start here, you find your mom. Mom is the source of nourishment. I generally believe, within modern humans at least, and you can actually see this in primates, responsibilities that one would see here would be nourish and protect. And then I think fathers are generally protect and encourage. So kind of a different tension. One of the other things that I should record here that is a little down in the weeds of microbiology, but interesting, is that when you think about all of your DNA and how it's broken apart, if you look at it with the unit of analysis as chromosomes, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? So you get one pair from each of your parents. But for the sex chromosome, the X and the Y, that's 1/23 of your complement, right? When you view them as pairs, which means that 22 out of 23 of your pairs of chromosomes have no idea whether they're going to end up being installed into a male or into a female. And I think that's important when we talk about leadership, because that means we have so much in common. Oh, good. One sec. edit this in post, right? Cool. So much more in common than we have that separates us. Leaders focus on that because I believe that leadership actually emerges from this model. All of leadership, because we can't get away from the fact that we're living a human experience. Like we're not doing leadership, we're doing human leadership. It's very different, right? We're not trying to lead cattle. That would be a different kind of leadership. We're not doing horses. Although you can lead horses, but it works differently. So I think this is, I'm working with these right now. So let's suppose that we have friend, right? This is again in the tribe, not quite as affiliated as sister or brother. Then you would have your friends as well. We talked about, well, maybe I talked about this. I believe that, and this is all going to be very, very, the conversation that we're going to have is gendered and assumes binary sex. Okay. The mark of friendship for a male, and I've asked around, I think to a man, every single person has said this is true. You know, like where acquaintances become friends is, would they have your back in a losing fight? You are in a fight with obviously other humans, and you're going to lose. And the question is, a friend won't let you go down alone, even if they get their butt kicked too, right? Males, that's the mark. I think you and I have discussed this. For females, for anybody watching, I would invite them to ask themselves the question first. But because of overt and covert competition in our species, there's both a status hierarchy among males and among females. They coexist. I believe there's only one other species in the whole world of species where status is computed for by both males and females. Normally it's just one or the other, right? Birds, for example, right? Often male competition for status, and then females choose among those that are competing for the status. Orca have a maternal competition structure because they're matriarchal. The males don't compete with each other, I don't believe. The females do. So, above friend, the most broad would be tribe. So this accounts for almost everything that you would see in, you know, the human experience for the last 200,000 years, right? Start wherever, orient yourself, figure out mother, figure out father. Assume, this is actually interesting, you assume positive intent among, like this is where you actually kind of, I think, begin to get your bearings on who are we friendly towards, who are we antagonistic towards. You assume positive intent from whatever you identified as mother and father. But this wasn't the only way that humans, these weren't the only people around humans at the time. So when you go, I don't know how to draw this. We'll draw it like this. Do you know where I'm going with this? Okay.
Not yet. Not yet.
So we have the unknown. This would be everything outside of tribe and outside of territory. And depending upon how big your tribe was, right? And there would almost have certainly been like splinter tribes from other ancestors a long time ago. But, you know, who knows what's up in, you know, the peaks of the mountain or the depths of the cave or across the hill, right? But we know perhaps, and this would have been, I think the experience would be there's other actors out there, right? let's suppose that they came across another human, or interestingly, actually, we know that humans like Homo sapiens interacted with other, other the genus Homo, where you have, Neanderthals and, Homo sapiens coexisting, even interbreeding, right? So there would have been the unknown, and the embodiment of the unknown in its human form is the stranger. First thing that one must do when they encounter a stranger is determine their intention. Right? So I think we have another circuit or an instinct. Again, we're looking at the voices of our ancestors. So the archetypal stranger, and that is as old as story, right? All of these are actually as old as story. Determine intentions. Now, I want to send this on two different directions from here.
A stranger, can I just say, a stranger is
Of
just
course.
another agent, though, right?
It's an agent from the unknown.
Well, any agent is unknown until we've done that processing on it, right?
Let's look. Let's suppose it's processed via the agent pathway. Does it have
Mm-hmm.
eyes? Does it move? Is it a resource or a threat?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think one of the strongest statements I've ever heard for capitalism is that it turns strangers into potential customers.
Yeah.
So people are met differently, right? It shifts people viewing strangers. I mean, it's insane to think that we live in cities of millions of people and we're not constantly worried about being stabbed, like not that you couldn't worry a little bit, but the fact that we don't the entire time is remarkable, right?
On the
So
most part, strangers aren't a threat, is what you're
yeah,
saying.
but we view them, people walk into a store most frequently greeted as a potential customer. So capitalism did a lot of that, right? And I don't want to make it about that yet. I actually do want to talk about capitalism another time, but let me get some of these thoughts out. So go in this direction as well. What do we know? Like, let's suppose that at this level, and it might literally just be about strangers, or it may be incomplete knowledge. I think it might actually be more incomplete knowledge. That it triggers like a summary judgment. Because you have to do this pretty quick, right?
Premature summary judgment with incomplete
Perhaps.
knowledge.
You would only know with time, right?
Mm.
So you run the risk of it being a premature summary judgment where you might reject a potential resource to you and your tribe. But the risk of it being a threat, I mean, you could easily see in biology, they talk about kin selection. I don't want to, it's actually still kind of a hot topic and debated. So let's not look at like whether your tribe's being selected for or against, but from the perspective of the individual. And again, I actually don't believe that humans, the proper unit of analysis for these sorts of interactions is like what we would identify as an individual, only because an individual is not a complete iteration of our species. They can't even, we're not meant to be alone. Like we are a tribal species. That is, like a bee isn't complete on its own, an ant isn't complete on its own. It's not the right unit of analysis to figure out what ants are. The colony is, and a tribe is, I think, the human one. But this does happen where humans encounter other tribesmen or tribeswomen. And I think in this process, if the most important thing to know are its intentions, because this in leadership, which we talked about, this is the thing that immediately recontextualizes all of the assumptions about a person. For example, I may clip this out later because it's very recent and in itself pretty fraught, but it's a good example of this. President Biden and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, United States withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
One can look at that, and let's suppose that we impugn selfishness to it. Actually, no, let's impugn selflessness to it first. So this is a person who understood that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was going to be extremely difficult, but necessary. We've been there for 20 years, and American blood had been spilled. He had to make the politically tough decision to pull the plug, cut our losses. It was going to be embarrassing. It turned out to be deadly. But we don't know how many lives it may have saved down the road, right? Like those lives aren't counted because it was done. And he negotiated in order to, by and large, allow for if we're assuming selflessness, right? He did his best to do his best to get as many people out. Like that's one version of it, and that casts them in a certain light. If you simply just one switch, right? Like one switch, like a light switch, okay? A light switch. If you just flick the switch the other way, let's assume that it wasn't selfless. Let's assume he was being selfish. Now retell the story. Same exact fact pattern, but everything changes context. So now he had made a campaign promise to withdraw the troops. He haphazardly did it when it benefited him, not when his generals were saying it was the appropriate time. He abandoned our allies. He left 19 million women, in the under the control of, let's say, folks that aren't they don't abide by Western standards for the treatment of women, right? The withdrawal was disastrous. 13, like all of it shifts with just one thing moving. Was he? Because we don't know him that well, right? Nobody knows anybody that well. And you barely know yourself. Not barely. You know yourself best, but there's all sorts of stuff about yourself you don't even know, right? One must assume that all of the self-help stuff is basically like you're doing your best. Assume positive intentions of yourself. Forgive yourself your mistakes. And then it allows you to frame things in that positive light about yourself, which leads to, your self-concept. But I think it's actually a reappropriation of this ability that humans have, probably mostly to judge the intentions of others. When you just apply that to yourself, then like if this evolved, go ahead.
I wonder if there's more about it serving you or not. Because I think there are situations where the stranger's intentions are poor, but what they're doing serves you in some way, and so that's okay.
Oh, that's very nuanced.
There's got to be a what's in it for me that determines whether the intentions are acceptable or not. Not whether they're evil or not, but just whether they're acceptable or not to me.
I think if one is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a thing, if that's potentially what we're talking about, or if it's, like, I also believe that the aphorisms and truisms and stories that we have inherited via culture are also lessons about what has worked for our ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We are also warned about those sorts of situations via story. Like there's no honor among thieves. So if you do align yourself, right, with those that you cannot trust, say World War II, the US was allied with Stalin, right? Like that was not going to work out in the long term, right? So yeah, I think you're right that it can be in a in a tribal setting 40,000 years ago. I'm not quite sure that the cycle time on these sorts of examinations. I mean, you would have to really quickly, and this is what chimpanzees do this. The young males will patrol their boundaries. They will do raiding parties into neighboring troops' territory. If they come across a male that they have more of, like if they have more power than the male, they'll kill the male of the other troop just because they can, while patrolling their own boundaries to make sure the same thing doesn't happen back. Right? That's like all of foreign affairs. Right? That's all geopolitics right there. It's just the males of our species patrolling boundaries that are kind of arbitrarily decided and setting incursions on the other. So let's suppose that that's a possibility for them to re-examine or stave off. I mean, deception, actually, that's a really good point. Deception. Humans have the ability to deceive, to conceal our intentions. That wouldn't exist unless that were adaptive, right? And that's a really good point, because that is the very thing that leadership is most vulnerable to, is we are constantly scanning for an unjust. We're constantly scanning. I'll show you what I think we're scanning for, but we're constantly checking to make sure that the situation we find ourselves in, because remember, our ancestors didn't know where we would land. It's possible that we would land in a tribe that was not good, right? That would have happened in the past. It may have been one where you would never be shared with. There's one that maybe it was like, I mean, literally evil, like the evil exists, right? And so I think that our surveillance, our like the sentinel function that we have to look for being treated. Oh, you know what? That's exactly where Jonathan Haidt's work plugs in. His book about the righteous mind, looking at the origins of human morality. All of those moral functions are looking for whether or not we are in a good tribe or a bad tribe, or whether our father is a good father, right? Or whether he is an evil, like, I think the father archetype ends up being something more like king, right? Like, are we operating under a just king or a just queen? In which case we approach that universe in a particular way. Or do we sense that it is an unjust king? And if it's unjust, and you feel like it's unjust, well, then the program that you run is one of subversion, right? You conceal your intentions, you conceal your thoughts, and you work to subvert the unjust alpha. And that was documented in chimpanzees by Jane Goodall with the documentation of the war. I can't remember the name of the. Anyways, it's like the best documented chimp war, where there was an alpha, as I recall the story. There was an alpha, and the alpha essentially was a jerk, right? Didn't do proper amounts of grooming or sharing. And one alpha is one alpha, but one alpha is generally not stronger than two betas, right? Two medium-sized, medium-strength males can generally overpower one, and three definitely can. So there's a tension there, right? There's a tension for leadership to be just, and if it's not, for that to be organized against. Like when we talk about leadership, and I've seen this a lot of times in when humans sense limited resources, I think that radar turns on. Like, okay, resources are limited. Is it being distributed fairly? Right? Maybe I think that's one of the hacks, actually, is targeting targeting or framing resources in ways that highlight what is abundant and what is shared, or depending upon your political goals, framing resources as scarce, right? Like, and all the politics, I think, once you have this laid out, what we'll see is that you can just target a couple of these variables, a couple of the human inclinations, feed in information that you want. And then what you'll find is that the human suddenly shifts the way that they view their boss or their boss's boss or the organization that they work at. And then everyone becomes subversive, right? Or you end up with like alliances forming, which is exactly what happened with the chimps. So there was an unjust alpha. He ends up getting beaten up, cast out, but his mother was still in the tribe. And I think mother and brother were still there. So he's on his own for a while, kind of like pretends to be subservient to get back in among the good graces of the rest of the tribe, does successfully, then begins to express his unjustness. And also bear in mind that this was being recorded by humans, so humans would see it through these lenses. But they end up overpowering him. It appears like he was literally held down by two of the males and then killed. Like, they tore off his testicles. They bled out through his hand, or one of his feet. Just a mess, right? Disaster. And then not only that, but his body was desecrated. Like, they ate him, which I don't think is a common chimpanzee. Like, this was like hostile, right? Super, super angry. And some of the females that had been most poorly treated were the ones that desecrated the body the most, interestingly. Yeah, like once there was a perception that it was, safe to resist the unjust ruler, right? I think this is something that you often see. Like, not a lot of action takes place until there is a sense that perceived alpha. I don't want to take that further than it goes in humans. We're not so alpha beta, but where there is something like an alpha, once they go down hard, right? Governor, again, not getting political in any particular direction, but Governor Cuomo, right? Allegedly had a long history of improprieties, but was extraordinarily powerful. But then once his power began to wane, once there was a crack, it was dozens of people coming forward at the same time. It's like I think it's almost the human organizational structural, what do they call it? Not quite facsimile, but what do you call it? If you were to make a wax figure of a simulacrum, right? It's like the human simulacrum of that tribal instinct. So I think that's always operating, and we're constantly scanning to see whether we're in an unjust situation or not. And then resource scarcity, that's what actually triggers it. Also, interestingly, that I'll mention here because we're recording, penicillin, right? So it's made by mold, right? Penicillium. Do you know when it makes it?
What makes it?
When
The
it
way
makes it. When the mold makes it.
No.
So it doesn't do it all the time. If it did it all the time, the bacteria around it would become resistant, right? It only does it, I believe, phosphates when the environment is phosphate deprived, because like DNA needs phosphorus and stuff. So it's like very important to have that particular nutrient. When it detects that there is when there's a resource deficiency, it turns on the genes to produce penicillin, nukes the soil around it, killing the bacteria, so that it doesn't make it all the time. It doesn't do it all the time. It's resource intensive to do all the time. But when it needs to, when it senses scarcity, it does it. And I think if humans are obviously sensitive to anything, it's like, do you have a scarcity mindset or do you have an abundance mindset? Because those are you're running two separate programs depending upon which one you think is true. All right. So what I want to talk about here is If one senses selfishness, I think this is where I don't quite know why. You'll often see a bifurcation in the way that humans view things, right? If there's a God, then there's a Satan, right? If there's a Vishnu, then there's a Shiva. If there's, we're not
Yin is a
operating
yang.
a ton of CPU, right? So I think we extrapolate from this architecture
Hmm.
through the lens of the stranger, or the intention determination, intention
Hmm.
scanning, the surveillance, right? So like tribe, but selfish. So a selfish tribe,
Hmm.
selfish relative to you, right? That is, it's what we call an enemy, right? Someone who is looking out for themselves, but not for you, who is hostile towards you. You assume lies, you assume selfishness. Like, remember I talked about like how you can frame somebody. If you just frame
Hmm.
them as selfish, then all of a
Hmm.
sudden a whole new universe of things apply.
Hmm.
So what would you call something like, because let's suppose that we're using these same slots, but backwards now. What would you call the equivalent of a friend, but in the spot of where you would have something like, what is a selfish friend to you?
Mm.
Like, it's the one thing a friend
Um,
can't be, right?
well, I don't know. Is that an acquaintance? Someone you know but you don't feel close to?
What if one assumes selfishness from them and not just neutrality? I guess neutrality might be an option here. That's
Well,
interesting.
then that yeah, that's not the definition of friend, then, is it? It's
Right.
mm,
You see where that's going? Like, it is the one thing a friend can't be.
mm,
In fact, it's the thing that challenges friendship or destroys
mm,
the friendship, right? Because if one assumes on this side of it, this is all, they have your back to some degree or other, right? They
mm-hmm,
have your back. One can count on their tribe, one can count on a friend, one can certainly count on their sister and brother,
mm-hmm.
mother and father. I mean, we'll get there, but this is a betrayer. When you start to think of story and archetypal story, so these are the archetype being the thing that is consistent across story, across multiple stories, the themes or truths that are consistent across are archetypal. We start to see these thematic elements emerging, right? So the betrayer, the friend that is selfish. When you look at Christian motifs, these like emerge almost immediately. Okay. Do you want to keep going, or are you getting tired?
No, I'm good. Keep going.
All right. I'm gonna draw this out here. This is where, oh man, I wish you would have seen Avatar, the Airbender. Told you, great story, perfectly encapsulates these. But it won't surprise me if I'm right, and if these are core for these very reasons, that not only will this apply to people, but I think it'll apply if we swap out what I'm calling abstractions, but compiled stories and assumed truths that we relate to as though they were actors and agents. We'll get
Mm-hmm,
there. That's not quite yet.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But imagine that. What is the stranger? So this way, I think these will end up being, although I haven't framed it out yet, something like, you know, a sister that betrays you or a brother that betrays you. The betraying brother is like the worst thing, right? Or a betraying son. Star Wars, for example, examines these sorts of things intensely. I think all story basically plays at these tensions. Like, what is it? Is it a, the relationship between brother and father? I don't know if you watch the new Star Wars or even the old ones, right? But it's about the tension of this relationship and whether or not we should categorize them here or whether we should categorize them here.
Mm-hmm.
The unresolvability is human drama, right? That's the whole essence of human drama. Is it this or that, or this or that, or this or that? Harry Potter, Snape serves as that function, right?
Yeah.
It's
interesting because if they're a friend and they betray, it is easy to then move them up to that betrayer category. But if it is brother,
oof.
That's where it's difficult. And that's where we're going to run into issues because why? Like, we find it harder to move them into that betrayer category if they're related to us by blood. Like, that's not serving us. So why do we do that? What's the evolutionary value of that?
So I think that's the thing. So remember, like, you're a cell born, you're one cell that will become 10 trillion, right? And what I said at the very beginning is that the voices of our ancestors, they knew that you would, let's suppose that they prepared you for either eventuality. They prepared you for a world in which you may have been born into a world with a pro-eusocial tribe, right? You find yourself in this space. You run one set of instructions among that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also prepared you. They also gave you the instructions for what to do if you found yourself here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what if you're not on this side of it? What if you're on this side of it?
Or you're finding yourself having to categorize people on that side of it.
Yeah, like
you're not finding yourself there. You're just finding that you're having to put people there, right?
So context. The way that I have this stacked is we have at its base, pattern recognition. Okay. Recognition. And these are like line, circle, shadow spaces, right? Just real raw architecture. You're looking for where are you?
Mm-hmm.
Then we have agent detection because they're an actor around. It's interesting because this agent detection, if you think about an enemy or a betrayer, there's actually ways of them moving that you anticipate they will do, right? Like they sneak, right? They lurk behind, like they come up behind you, right? It's interesting how quickly, like, just this this very easily adjusted framing works. But then there's also context loading. So where are you? What rule set are you applying? I'm calling it context rule loading. You and I discussed it the other night, but I'll say it again for the recording. This is something like when you're in your living room and you walk into your bedroom or your bedroom closet to get something. But the second that you get there, you've moved through a transitionary space and you show up in the closet and have zero idea why you're there. Absolutely no idea. Zero. Like, you could not, if you had to, if your life depended on it, it's just not accessible. That is because humans load different rules for a comportment, really, like how they're going to behave in each space. And as you transition spaces, we have such limited working memory that you just dump whatever you just had. Period. Like, there's no way around it. The only way to remember something across, going from like one space into another, is to talk to yourself as you're moving across, reminding yourself why you're going there. Like, you have to hold it in actual verbal, like, reasoning memory. Otherwise, it'll just get dumped. Happens to everybody. It's part of being human. But this context rule loading, I think we do that. This is related to leadership. The very first thing you do when you walk into a new space, you scan for threats and you determine status. And so we talked about this, like, again, another thing that I've asked all sorts of people, and actually literally to a person, every single one of them agrees. Say you walk into a bar, you're male. What's the first thing that you don't even necessarily think it, because it's so ancient of an instinct, but it's there. When you go into a room full of other humans, so this is like, oh, agents, potential agents, run the math, right? And actually, it does do this math exactly. Are they a threat? And you're right, it's not even attack destroy, because this could be monitor, right? So when you walk into a room and you're male, the question that gets answered, whether you realize it or not, and I think if you just pay attention, you do realize it, is who could take me in a fight? That's the math. Who in this room could take me in a fight? And from that determination, status is immediately, you derive status from there. Where do I fit into this pecking order? Am I the male in the room? Am I the alpha? All right, you stand up a little taller. You're a little louder, right? So there's a bunch of rules that then come along with that status. If you're not, a bunch of strangers, some that could take you. You probably have a different demeanor, right? And then for females, when they walk into a new space, do you want to share what you think? Maybe you walk into a bar. What's
Yeah,
the
it's are
first
they
situation?
a more attractive mating option than me or not?
Yeah, isn't that crazy? And I'm wondering, let's suppose you walk into a bar. Is the first thought in your experience, and only speaking to your experience here, although I'd like to explore this with other people, do you scan the females first or the males first?
I would definitely say females. Who's hotter than me?
Interesting. That's so interesting. And for males, it's like males first then. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I would love to survey that and see if that holds more broadly. Okay. So context and rule loading, I think has a lot to do with this. I'm trying to remember. Like, this is where we start to stack some of these. This is the underlying architecture. And we're appropriating these capacities into the way that we manage our 21st century lives. But they're really based on stuff that we derived 80,000 years ago, right? It makes sense if you walked into a new territory, which is how humans would frame it. This is because we're tribal, right? And we're territorial. This is our territory. Who's here? What are their intentions? Who could take me? Who's the most whatever? Because that's a status thing. So
What do you think, though, of the fact that if we look at this concept of tribe, that historically you were more or less born into a tribe, you didn't choose it, whereas now we would tend to have a bit more agency over who is in our tribe. So historically, you could have enemy, betrayer within your tribe. It doesn't need to be a stranger. You're having to manage that. Whereas now, you're choosing your tribe. So the betrayer, the enemy, you're, precluding from your inner circle. What do you
that's
think
an
about that?
interesting. There's an aspect to this that is troubling, which is I think most of this math is done before you're 5. It's probably done before you're 3, right? Cementing who is tribe, who is not, who is enemy, who is friend, right? There's an ability to check and recheck, right? But stuff that goes into you before you're 5 is almost impossible to pull back out later. Those initial abstractions about tribe become, I don't know, we'll call them semi-permanent. So, for example, from a Western perspective, going back and looking at like the political universe of like communism versus, Western capitalism, right? People that are of that era or folks that had very strong tribal identities. When you get to super social identities, you can easily, well, see, that's the context, right? If the planet were attacked by aliens, everyone knows that immediately you would stop caring about where you're from, or what, like you would just stop caring, right? If it was a humans versus something, we just boom, we load, you reset the context, and then
Yeah, well,
everyone
you
becomes
see
solid.
that, don't you? You see that instinct. If it's state versus state, they're enemies. But if it's the US versus another country in a
Mhm.
sport, then we're all Americans.
And it's terrifyingly easy to move that. Remember
Yeah,
when
yeah.
Stalin was our ally in 1945, and by 1948 we were in the Cold War. Like by 49, it was like pointing nukes at each other, right? What happened? 1984 does explore this. How easily our this when we talk about leadership, this is
But
I
that's
think where
good news. I mean, that's good news for leadership models. You know, that fact that loyalties are so easily changed, or there's that's a really good point, actually, that it's so easy to shift that culture from first it was us versus them, but now it's we're united against that. It has
Mhm.
a great application for leadership, and it's
So
encouraging.
you and I were discussing hackability. I think a lot
Hmm.
of this, like what I want to do is I want to establish a model here that lends itself towards understanding where we are desperately vulnerable to being hacked. Um, when there are political interests involved, if I can convince you, because say there's only two options for an election, right? Someone's going to win, somebody's going to lose. If I can cast the opposition through a lens of selfishness compellingly,
Mm.
because you don't know enough about the person, right? I don't know President Trump directly, right? Most of us rely on, or President Biden or anybody, like your school board member that you're going to vote for. It doesn't matter, right? But when you're in a situation where one must decide, okay, this person that I have imperfect knowledge of, are they selfish or are they selfless, right? Are they down?
Mm.
Do I cast them in one of these categories, or do I, which they will attempt to do, they'll attempt to identify a common ground with you so that they seem like they're part of your tribe. But ultimately, that we are infinitely vulnerable in the context, like from one moment to another. So we must defend against it in the sense that we should be mindful. The human morality lesson, which I can build on later, which comes from Jonathan Haidt, I think he has it exactly right. Um, be very careful about what you're disgusted by, right? Be very careful. Brene Brown says, well, she doesn't talk about disgust, but she talks about, if I know who you blame and what you fear, it tells me you almost everything. Like if I know who you blame for whatever, and it could be anything, global warming, right? Who do you blame? All right. What do you fear? And then also what disgusts you, because that's a core instinct. It's as core as all of these things. It's actually more
Hmm.
core. It's below this. Um, if I know what disgusts you, I can with that those 3 points, I can triangulate well a whole lot about you. What you probably also think about 30 other things, right? It's
Mm.
I've actually done this with classes before where I've asked them to like talk about an issue that they have fear around, and then attribute like where do they cast the blame. So like we talked about I like 4x4s, right?
Mm.
So if you look at like the community, it was in community relations that we talked about this. You look at the community of off-roading enthusiasts, right?
Hmm.
So like, okay, let's frame that as a tribe, cast it as a tribe, off-road enthusiasts. What do we fear? Well, we fear roads being closed off permanently. Who do we blame? Environmentalists, right? Like in the American West, this is pretty standard politics,
Mm.
but environmentalists who shut down access to public land because of environmental impact or whatever, ecosystem degradation. Like, cases can be made in either way. If you're an environmentalist and you just reframe it all, right, and you see that roads are causing watershed issues or damage to vegetation, you just reframe it all and it becomes the other way around. So I don't know that this is, I think this is movable, right? You can just take this framing and tweak it, and that's what the interested parties around us do, is they attempt to move this to fit their what benefits them.
And when we talk about hackability, like, yes, that can be manipulative in a political sense, but it's also really usable in the leadership sense when you look at, like, if we circle back to what you were saying about how easy it is to change that us and them mentality, state to state versus now country to country. Suddenly, those two warring states are acting together because it's the US against, some other country. If you're in a corporation and there are warring departments or, factions within the company, and you're tasked with shifting that culture's notoriously slow to change. However, if you use this framework to then say, well, our main competitor is insert betrayal, insert selfishness, insert lies. Now we've built that we're a tribe. We have to have an enemy because, as you say, it's human nature. So now you're using that to leverage your own tribe to be united.
And where I've seen that dynamic play well, so I think that is 100% spot on, right? Leaders, this is my, it comes from strengths-based leadership. It's not actually like the point of the book. It's kind of like a little gem in it that it talks about. It uses I think they use it. My favorite definition of leadership is that which inspires followership. All right, can't lead without followers. There's certain things that inspire followership, and those things that inspire followership are in that book. And this is, I don't remember how many tens of thousands of people they surveyed. Trust, compassion, stability, and hope. These are what followers need.
But everything is a double-edged sword. Everything. Hackability used for political gain versus, a simple way to unite a company with a fractured culture. You look at those four things and, that's how cults are built.
Yeah. Well, these are
leaders building followership is how cults are built. It's also how great leadership is done. So somewhere along the line, those traits, the intention, and then that's what you were talking about, deception.
Yeah, ultimately it's whether do they truly, well, let's go to the next thing, because there's a third thing here that it's poorly explored, but I think is in the way that we have this model, I think, firmly established in us. And also like the anti-tribe, the anti-friend, right? This, which the gateway to that framing is perceived selfishness, right? The cult leaders that you can identify are obviously cult leaders because they're obviously selfish, right? Like they cared about themselves more than about their followers. And within the leadership context of an organization, that is exactly the thing, that as soon as somebody believes that the leader is selfish, they lose the followers, right?
So how are the ones in the cult not having the followers see the selfishness. Because if that's a black hole, that's what we need to identify so that people can determine whether it is
So
deceptive or not.
I think that happens here at the level of determining intentions. You and I discussed this. We'll discuss it again. I believe that transparency, honest transparency, nearly perfect, if not perfect, transparency. It is a hallmark of durable leadership, right? Maybe you can have temporary leadership by hiding the truth from your team, right? But I mean, there is a motif, and a lot of these things I think will be reaffirmed through stories that are popular. It's kind of how you know that you're dealing with something common to all humans, is all humans tell the same sorts of stories. But there is something about, you know, the lieutenant who says we probably won't make it through this battle, but this is important for our wives and children that we're leaving behind, you know, like whatever, like that thing. That's what you follow up a hill you know you're going to die on, right? Is that they were truthful to you. So I believe transparency is actually the thing, right? But when we're looking at, you were saying, how this gets hacked the other way.
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing that the problem is when you have somebody that you don't know, like the way that people get into cults almost always is that they're brought in by somebody that they trust who is just not, right? So it's propagating through trust lines, right? Because at the end of the day, the person you know yourself is best is yourself, right? Followed by your mother and father, presumably, depending on how that worked. You have direct experience with some of these, but as you get further and further away from direct experience, you're guessing, right? Like I said earlier, like you're abstracting, you're drawing from, I call this like the marvelization. I think I just called it that today. The marvelization of the world. So if you think about the Marvel movies, you could also call it the Disneyfication, but actually Disney owns Marvel. Funny. But the epic stories, right? The epic stories where you have I mean, this also applies to the Bible and the Quran and everything else, but any epic story, you have truly evil people, right? You have a a destroyer of the universe, right? Or you have Magneto, and then you have Professor Xavier, and their cast is exactly opposites, right? One, and actually where the drama comes in is in the times with like Professor X, when he acts selfishly. That's kind of where they tweak the story to make it dramatic. Or Magneto actually switches to realize that there's greater threats, right? Playing with these ideas that push and pull of, I don't know, is Snape good? Is he bad? Like, which is he? Is he one of these or one of these? Is he one of these? There's evidence on both sides. I don't know. Let me go back to the transparency. What was I going to say? It was about impugning the motives, I think. I can't remember. I kind of lost my train of thought there. Do you remember where I was going? You're talking about,
well,
hacking.
we had led, we had led to how, because what I'm intrigued by with a cult is, I mean, it falls apart invariably, but they are hugely successful in terms of gaining followership. You talk about great leaders are the ones that draw in followers. But so do cults. So if you can have
I didn't say
you
great
want to
leaders.
use
I
that
just said leadership. Yeah, leadership itself.
leadership itself, yeah. So if you can, like, what are the aspects that build followers, loyal followers very quickly within a cult?
Well, let me back up a little bit and talk about gossip, right? I had a conversation with one of my mentors. We were talking about gossip in the workplace because I've seen that just literally tear functional units apart, right? So because we don't know people well enough to predict their intentions or their future actions, which would be the whole point of understanding an agent, right? You want to know an agent so that you know what it's going to do. Mirror neurons are probably involved on the neural architecture part here. So, you know what? I just realized I should have done.
We can pause now if you need.
No,
After a
no, I
while.
did. I just want to make sure that this is going to record my screen. I can always get it later. So cults get started by infected people. Well, without talking about anything in particular, anything that goes into you before you're 5, you're probably going to believe, no matter how, from anyone else's perspective, ridiculous it is, right? To go back far enough to where we're not talking about anybody's particular beliefs anymore, right? You look at like ancient religions' beliefs, like those are ridiculous and they're so obviously preposterous, right? But from the perspective of others, right? But they were given to them by people they trusted. Like the stories, if you want to know something about a person, just ask what stories they believe are true. That's really all you need to know. Like, what stories do you think are true? That almost helps determine tribe, actually, because tribe is determined by shared story. But if it goes in early enough by trusted sources, the tribal elders, by parents, it just goes in and basically stays in unexamined. It's very hard to get somebody out of a cult deprogramming, right? I actually have another, and we'll not have time to talk about it tonight, but fear, obligation, and guilt and their relationship to, and maybe it will, because there is a way
Maybe that's the answer.
Well, I think it is. It's how you break a person.
Yeah.
Fear,
Fear, obligation, and guilt.
Yeah, they're the methods. Well, it's not just that. Just a little hint here. It's fear, obligation, and guilt when you hold the person in a double bind, where they're damned if they do and damned if they don't, for reasons that I also think are related to this model. This framework actually encapsulates it. But if I can induce, in psychology, they call it learned helplessness. If I can induce learned helplessness, that you learn that there is nothing that you can do. Like, it's a little bit of a tangent, but let's go there for a moment. With, say, pimps, right? Because it's a very quick, they can break people quickly, right? And it's a refined approach, right? So fear, obligation, and guilt manifest blatantly, obviously, and consistently in that, terrible, usurious, predatory universe. Fear, in the literature, sometimes it's called guerrilla pimping, right? This is where they're physically hurt, right? But the thing is like, if you stay, you might get hurt. But if you leave, you also might get hurt. That might. Like, you assume that you will either way. And when you hold a person there where you don't know in that space, the double bind, that induces submission. Like, that's actually the way I think, for reasons that we'll talk about later, that submission is it's almost the fawning thing that we had talked about earlier. It's adaptive, but it keeps you there, and it's very hard to help somebody out once they've been double bound. They have to believe that there is a safe place, a different safe place. There was an experiment done, Stanford in the 60s got away with a lot of stuff, right? They did experiments on dogs, and it's actually where the idea and concept of learned helplessness emerged from, where they took dogs, put them in a cage. Broadly, did different variations of this, but broadly, they would shock the cage. So dogs are in the cage, and in the more complicated one, they were like tethered to each other. But put them in a cage, basically shock the cage. The dog would try to move in a way that it wouldn't get shocked. Like maybe it was leaning up against the wall, right? So it would like move over to the other wall. And the shocks were sporadic and random. There was no consistency to them, but brains try to find the consistency. There was no consistency to it. So the dog would like lay down, and after a couple of days, it just stopped trying. Stopped trying to avoid the shock. That wasn't that interesting. That was just sad, right? What surprised the researchers was that when they opened the doors to the cage, dogs didn't try to leave. They learned that there was nothing that they could do, including escape. And what they ended up doing literally was moving the paws of the dog to remind itself that it could leave. And then once it experienced a world outside of that pain, then it had learned that it was not helpless. Bad relationships operate with fog, like abusive relationships. Fear, obligation, and guilt are used to induce submission. And I guess since we're talking about it most broadly, the abuser, I believe that the abuser, like the hallmark of an abuser, is the attempt to regulate their emotions by controlling the behaviors of others.
Yeah.
So they haven't learned their own emotional regulation.
Yeah.
This is also what bad managers do.
Uh-huh.
Bad managers will utilize this toolbox of fear, obligation, and guilt rather than creating spaces of trust, compassion, stability, and hope. But fear, obligation, and guilt. Obligation just to wrap up the stories of sexual trafficking. Obligation, it's not uncommon for, it's actually the most common way to do it, where all money will be taken, if we're assuming women are the prostitutes in this case, all the money will be taken from them and all things will be purchased by their pimp. So then it becomes I buy you shoes, I buy you all these fancy clothes, I buy you purses, so that there's absolute obligation owed, or at least it's sensed that it's owed to their abuser. And then guilt is extremely powerful. When people have in mind, I was involved in some of our community efforts to address sex trafficking in Las Vegas, because obviously there's a ton of it here. And so you learn about the ways that people fall victim to it on the exploited side. And sometimes it's the folks you would never imagine, right? They're just people, right? Just like anybody's daughter, right? Or anybody's son. But guilt, this is called Romeo pimping, often is how they get there. So this is like, I love you, you're my girlfriend, you're my boyfriend, whatever. And then they'll intentionally get them arrested. Young people, 16, 17, 15, whatever. And they'll get them arrested to separate them from their parents. Like, you can't ever go back. And also, pimps also have this culture where they always get the person no matter what. So you can't ever get away. Like they'll get them out of jail always. It's like a thing. 100% of the time is how they view it. But the guilt is like, they'll never want you back. Like, think about what you are now. Now you got a rap sheet. Now everybody knows. And then they can separate people off in that direction too. So these are these are exploits, I guess is what you would call them, that you need to be careful about. You can use fear, you can use obligation, and you can use guilt in a healthy way. Those are possible to be used in a healthy way, but those are dependent upon the intentions of the person that is, you know, and I think that those are used also to assist in its beneficial sense, to assist in the emotional regulation of others. This is, like I said earlier, like the general or the lieutenant charging up a hill, right?
Mm,
What they do is they run first up the hill, right? If somebody is cowering in fear and they see their commander charging in the lead, it's that thing. You can't let him go down alone, right? You're obligated. It's a human instinct to follow. Yeah, and there are consequences to decisions. So fear is not always wrong. You need to be taught, an appreciation of the consequences, but that depends on intention. All right, I want to get one more thing here, which is, I have to put it over here, this direction. So if not selfishness and lies, and when you expand this out, by the way, and you get back up to father and mother, those archetypes, right? The betraying brother, the betraying sister. It's like the tyrant king on the father's side, or I don't know, what do you call a selfish mother who's only interested in themselves?
just manipulative, like a. Mm.
If you apply these larger than even king, like what the all father, right? Or the all mother, it's where you start to get up into like God status, right? Like, what is the father of all fathers, right? What is the mother of all mothers? The brother of all brothers, even the archetypal stranger, actually, I think is really important. I believe there's another road, that when you see a stranger and you don't know where they can be, there's also a kind of stranger that instead of selfish, they are selfless, right? They would sacrifice themselves for your benefit. It's
Why?
more. So that's a good call. We would probably say because of love.
They haven't known you enough to love you yet.
I know. Well, it depends on how you define love. I think it's actually I think the selflessness is what makes it love.
Mm-hmm.
Like you and I discussed this about like, what is love? And I think you said it's when you treat others as you would yourself.
Yeah, or that, well, depends on the type of love, but that feeling that you would give your life for someone else to live.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Which is more than treating them as self. It's when, like, this idea of sacrifice and selflessness, right? What happens when you find a stranger who would sacrifice themselves for you? It's something more, right? It's you don't have to go very far to start bumping into very important stories, right? Love and truth, selflessness, self-sacrifice, right? I think this takes us down the road. Like, this is when we're talking about like things get religious in this model, right? If one can imagine the selfish version of all of this, I think one can also imagine the purely selfless. Your tribe that would lay itself down to protect you is how most people perceive nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The friend that would sacrifice their life to save yours. In a Christian sense, especially the brother, right? Or the father that would sacrifice the most important things to them to save you, right? That sends us down this channel. And the hallmark here, I believe, is self-sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
It's believing that the intentions are not selfish, but you believe that the intentions are selfless. And when you're in a loving relationship with a person, the hallmark of love is that they sacrifice the things that are important to them to improve your life.
So for that stranger to act selflessly and from love towards you as a stranger to him or her,
Mm-hmm.
that stranger has not gone through the agent screening process of threat versus resource. So why is that person acting selflessly? They've missed the step themselves.
Yeah, see, one must potentially doubt their intentions, right? You must, I don't think you can help it. You know, like a computer, I don't know, a lot of this actually kind of works in a computer metaphor as well. But when you're looking to detect something, some amount of processing time is dedicated to checking the status of a sensor, right?
Mm.
So in this is where we get back to Jonathan Haidt's morality channel, his channels of morality. You have neural sub-processing that happens at nearly the same level as like shadows and lines, where you're looking for betrayal, right? You're looking for unfairness. It's scanning all the time for patterns that, and this actually is like all the way back. You're born with this capacity to view people that are being treated unfairly or treating others unfairly, people that are not caring, if they're being uncaring. You have an uncaring part of your brain that just monitors for things that look uncaring. For some people, those are most of what they're constantly scanning for. He presupposes that some of the other ones are justice. Like there needs to be a consequences. Like if you see somebody cut somebody off in traffic and nothing happens, there'll be like a punitive instinct. Like you want to make them suffer for having done the bad thing, right? What else does he have? He has harm care. Disgust is he has sanctity as well. Things that are unclean. Can't let unclean things in, so constantly scanning for things that are unclean. Old circuits. And then what those get primed with, it depends on your culture. So
then if you're back to the selfless stranger.
Like, I don't know how familiar you are with the Bible, but like I was a stranger and you let me in. Like there is so much stranger motif and metaphor in the accounting of Jesus Christ in the New Testament.
Actually, this is what the entirety of collaborative consumption is based on. Airbnb, you're letting a stranger stay in your house. Uber, you're letting a stranger ride in your car. This whole new ecosystem is built on that. So you're right. Like, why does that work? On paper, it shouldn't.
Well, I think it works because of something new, which is vouchsafing. People don't buy generally from people that don't have reviews online, right? Airbnb operates because other people have gone, maybe there's some brave people who just don't care, but other people have gone there safely and left testimonies behind themselves, right? So the person that you're interacting with has been vouchsafed.
Or Uber does ID checks on their drivers before they're allowed to use the app or whatever. So there's also an external agent doing that vetting process for you.
The 5-star model does so much work in our modern economy. Like, how many stars do you give them? Like, we don't think about.
Isn't it just a formalized, digitized version of what used to be like, oh, Bob up the street, yeah, he's a good guy. Like, it's just
Yeah, well, so you're inferring
volumized
from the
version of
stranger.
that.
Yeah, yeah, because the thing that pushes your, I don't know, your accepted truth, your tentatively, we could probably call that like your tentatively accepted truth, like what you think is true about the person broadly. That is pushed by stories that you've heard. If a person's being transparent or it's like directly visible to you, then you use your own judgment. But if it's not, you use the next step is trusted sources. And if there's a lack of trusted sources, or the trusted sources are themselves misinformed, then it presents as gossip, or I guess in this sense, in its positive way, it would be like a review, right? Or
Ratings or
yeah,
or references.
yeah, references preferably by people you know or have heard of, right?
Within the industry, exactly.
So let's like summarize this. This will be enough for now. Like I've been thinking that this is an important, I really want to build out this part because I think that at its end, you almost can't do a podcast now without talking about DMT, right? But there seem to be a lot of folks who have experiences at the end of the all selfless, all accepting, all safe, right? Like it's almost as though if every human that does a particular thing has the same experience, then it must be in us in some way. Like we're looking to identify some pattern, and the fulfilled version of that pattern recognition, if one can get access to it, is experienced as the transcendental. It's experienced, the father of all love, right? Like that's found everywhere, right? Religiosity is 100%. It's ubiquitous in human culture. And I think it might be because we're framing things this way. Like if this is just how we always see it, and then we just reframe it as like, oh, but it's selfish. Okay, well then it looks like this. Or, oh, it's maybe even more, it's like the quintessence of tribe. It is the truest embodiments of selflessness. That's where you find the stories of it's like the purest of the human experience, right? The story of Bambi, the mother that lays down her life, or the loss of the mother. Harry Potter, any of the extremely popular stories, right? Harry Potter, the mother that lays down her life, or Dumbledore, like the archetypal father, right? And you know that they're a thing because of how these all play out. Ron and Hermione, like the tension that they have is whether they'll be corrupted by the evil that they're trying to fight, by the Horcruxes, right? A little Harry Potter-esque, but whether the ring in Lord of the Rings will turn Samwise against Frodo. Will they be corrupted by the evil? When you go down this direction, it's literally the father of all lies is how like Satan is described, right? Always selfish, betraying, like the stories, any of these old stories. That's what I was saying earlier. Like, I think all conclusions, if this is a totalizing model or something close to a totalizing model, you'll be able to tell because the endpoints of the stories will be probably gods. Like they'll be manifested in story form as gods. But not just Western stories. Like it should probably be all stories. So later on, I want to talk more about fog because fear, obligation, and guilt, I think, is how you, if you feel like those are being used against you by your managers, then it all goes to crap, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
This is how you identify. If you're to ask, like, what do you believe the intentions are of your manager? Just that's all you need to know. Like, do you believe that they're primarily acting out of selfishness or selflessness? You want to be in one of the ones where the staff.
I mean,
even
we're
in
also saying like it's black and white. The reality is it's a spectrum, I guess. And people believe that other people are acting somewhere along the line of a spectrum, but for purposes of explaining this.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is actually. I don't think people maintain nuanced opinions about the primary.
Yeah. If you're talking about opinions, yeah, I
Yeah.
understand.
So you might have a scattering of it. I mean, literally half of America thinks that Trump was something along the lines of like a righteous, self-sacrificing, protective, you know, um, like a protecting brother or something, right? And then the other half that view him as like an evil tyrant, right? Well, there's actually something kind of interesting here that I think applies that I'll mention just because curious if other people watch this and what they think. But the archetype, the marvelization. So you have people viewing Trump as, Magneto, although, like quintessentially bad. And then the story that gets told among some people about Biden is basically Biden is like sleepy and not guarding the kingdom, while Vice President Harris is conniving, right? Like a Loki character and a sleeping Allfather, like Odin, right? It's just like it's so funny how we're using the stories that we know, because I think the stories that we know are stories that we talk about because they resonate with these parts of the way that we frame the world. So they're retold because they're stories that make sense to us because we make sense of everything this way, I think. At least anything relational, anything that is an agent, we apply this framework. How could we have developed any other framework? This is the only, these were the only variables of agents around us. I mean, there could be like a predator, which would be part of the unknown, not the unknown stranger. Oh, maybe. That's interesting. Where would dragons fit? The supernatural, the monster. It's every story has a monster, right? Story of Grendel, like the oldest stories. There's always a monster out in the unknown. I don't know. What do you think, dear?
Well, I am very visual, and I love conversations this way. I really followed that beautifully and really understood it, and really, I loved seeing where the sticking points were for me. So, and now that I've seen it in this visual format, I can see where we've tied those previous conversations into this. So I see where you're going. I feel like I have a bigger overall view of your brain and where it's going with all of this. So this has been really interesting.
Thank you. I think this holds at its heart, we're managing humans. And humans scan for unfairness. It's like that's as a leader. Can I say one other thing here that's interesting?
Yeah, of course.
So going back to fear, obligation, and guilt, like I've built a leadership program around that. It's a method of control, right? It's a method of coercion. It's not just a method of coercion that can be used on others. You can use it on yourself. And in unhealthy dynamics, cognitive behavioral therapy teaches you to notice thoughts that you might be applying to yourself. One that would be identified as unhealthy, but truly are coercive, right? When you're trying to make yourself be something you aren't, or you're holding yourself in a position that you don't want to be in, that's the most common. You're in a relationship that you know you should have left, but you're feeling obligated, and you're holding your own self there out of a sense of obligation or guilt, because say, you're married, or you know, and you have strong feelings about divorce, or you know, what would life be like? Like, I wouldn't be able to make it, which is frankly true in some situations, especially, you know, it's a big world and sometimes it's not, you know. But when you're treated, there's two things. When you're being treated unfairly, you sense, and I think that that's just a thing that humans scan for. When you're being treated unfairly and you're angry about it. So anger is the appropriate adaptive emotion. Let's call it one of the core emotions. Some people call it a secondary emotion, but I like it as a primary one. Anger is the mustering of resources to fight. Or, like, that's the emotional state, like calling emotions just physiological states, right? Anger is, it can be fight or flee, but it's mostly fight, like anger. But when you mix these together, it's called resentment, right? You sense unfairness and you're angry, you end up resentful. If you end up resentful against yourself, because you're using fog, you're using fear, obligation, and guilt to hold yourself someplace you don't want to be, right? Like the whatever version of human, if you go kind of to the core human in you, that becomes a really tangled knot, right? And I think that noticing when it happens, this is all that really has to happen. In my management approach, where we're dealing with fog, it's just seeing when fear, obligation, and guilt are being used against you, as opposed to establishing trust, compassion, stability, and hope. Trust having subcomponents of competence, right? Competence and intention, that's what makes trust. So you trust their intentions and you believe that they're competent. If you want to destroy the followership of others, say politically, like you want your party to win, you attempt to cast the other leader as incompetent or malintentioned. And if you can, using trusted sources of news or something, whatever you control that somebody trusts, you can undermine the leadership, have them recast under this light. And then I think that the modality that humans apply when they believe that they're here, so in the voice of the ancestors, as you were being prepared for any of these, is if you find yourself in one of these, then it's conceal, lie, subvert, undermine.
That's why I find it so hard to like make opinions sometimes, because I'm aware of this. I'm aware that, you know, political leaders will be framing the other as such and such due to hackability rather than who they actually are. So you know, it's hard to then know what is a picture that's being painted about them versus what is actually who they are. It's a confusing time.
Earlier we were talking about just something that we were just discussing. With any given subject, you can ask yourself, you should ask yourself, like, if you were forced to write an essay about the thing that you're discussing, like whatever, right now Russia and Ukraine are kind of big deals, right? So if you're forced to write an essay about Ukraine, how many sentences would it be of things that you are saying are true about it? Like, how many true things do you know about Ukraine?
Yeah, not much at all.
Yeah, almost all of us could struggle to put together a paragraph, right? The more interesting question about it would be like, okay, so those are the things that you are supposing to be true about it. You know, it's abstracted idea of like a nation, even though it's incredibly complicated. All of the things are complicated, like infinitely complicated. But suppose that we pretend that we can work with the idea. Why do you believe the things that you just wrote are true? And what was your trusted source for gathering them? So if you're worried that you're being gaslit, right? It's gaslighting that you're talking about, right? If you're worried about being gaslit, you would want to examine the sources of the information that, I mean, that's actually This is all like fog, right? Fog from a trusted source is the recipe for an abusive relationship. They pretend to be worthy of trust, but they're actually regulating their own emotions by controlling yours. So it's like the double bind, if it comes from a trusted source, you're toast. You don't have very long. Just like the dog in, you know, the cage. Like, you don't have very long before you'll just submit. It's what happens. You can break anybody, anyone, and maybe not even trusted, but hopeless, right? The double bind. I mean, it's a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, right? But not because they were trusted, but because you approached a life-threatening situation, or a situation that triggered maybe, I don't know exactly, but fawning, fleeing, fighting. Yeah, these are what get mustered right away. But then if you don't know what to do and you get stuck, then it just leads to submission. And then if you're familiar with the abuse cycle, right, it ends up with submission, relieving of anxiety, believing that you're close. The anxiety of the abuser grows. The abused person pulls away, which increases the anxiety of the abuser. The abuse cycle escalates until there's something that causes the victim to pull away. Then there's a pursuit. You know the abuse cycle, yeah? Yeah, there's a whole universe of stuff there. I know that you're saying that like you expect it. You expect the maneuvers, the political maneuvers. But I don't think you expect the political maneuvers with, I don't know, trust. For me, trust is the confidence that derives from having been in a vulnerable place and have emerging safely. So you go to a space of vulnerability, you make it across, trust grows. And then next time you're willing to go to a more vulnerable place, you make it safely across, trust grows. We have to be really careful of who we trust. I mean, isn't that what the whole world is suffering from right now? It's not knowing who to trust.
Exactly. You and I have been playing that game and just trying to build a relationship.
Yeah, as everyone must. I think I got all of my broad ideas out. Helping people, like I told you my Twitter goal, like my Twitter and LinkedIn and everything. My summary of my work is about ending cycles of pain and poverty because of my background. Fear, obligation, and guilt. That's, if you can turn somebody on, and I'll invite you to do this, like at work. Look for it being leveraged by people.
There's an absolute classic example of that. And
Okay, be careful, like we're recording this, so like let's not get specific.
Oh, good point.
But just keep an eye out, monitor, okay?
Yeah.
And then the graduate level version of that is notice when you're tempted to do it yourself. Intentions, competency, compassion, stability, hope. There's one last thing that I think is worth also noting here. There's 3 kinds of story. These are all about stories, right? So what story do you think fits what archetype fits, but like what story do you think, what stereotype do you think is best fits the person that you're trying to guess at? You know what I mean?
Mm.
So like, are they like a good father? Or are they like a bad father? Are they like, so this would be like a patronizing boss, right? That doesn't see how good you are or whatever. But the three kinds of story, there's a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. This might be a tribe. Like I'm from Las Vegas. What do we tell ourselves about ourselves? I don't know, an intellectual, right? Or I have a PhD. What do PhDs say about people that have PhDs, right? What do we tell ourselves about ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
There's the stories that we tell about others. Like, so this is about others. And then there's the stories that others tell about us. The stories that we say about others, that's derivable from like listening. This would be something along the lines of doing a focus group, right? This is how you get at that kind of knowledge. The stories that others tell about us, that's reputation. We monitor that really closely as human. And you access that. Well, so this is like the target population. The ones that others tell about us, you survey, right? So you want to find out what people think about whatever. So we tell ourselves about others. I'm trying to remember what I wanted to say about this. Tell ourselves about ourselves. These are all influenceable differently. Stories that we tell ourselves about others, that's leadership that does that, right? What is our relationship to our customer? What is our relationship to China? What is our relationship to whatever? Pick your thing, right? What others say about us, you affect through marketing. It's just a marketing target. You attempt, I think what you actually do, this is actually correct. What you do in marketing is you establish a sense of ourself, right? Like, oh, going back to like early marketing efforts, 1950s, you know, housewives caring for the home. So this is like housewives. Okay. What kind of, if I identify as a housewife, what sort of detergent do I buy? So it's influenced by showing housewives using, say, Tide, right? Like if I believe myself to be an independently minded maverick, what kind of cigarette do I smoke, right? In the 60s. So they show an independently minded maverick smoking, you know, a Marlboro or a Camel, whatever. Marketing, but you establish the sense of what we are, and then we tell ourselves a particular story about us. In business world, like that's also leadership. You create a strong sense of us, team, tribe, and then you affirm that we tell ourselves, you affirm positive stories about it, not negative ones. If I work someplace and I believe that we all suck and we're all lazy, then we will probably all suck and be lazy, right? Because you won't feel weird about it. Like, yeah, nobody works hard here, right? But I think the Soviet Union largely collapsed because of that. The nature of the stories they told themselves about themselves changed, and they lost the battle there. All right, dear. I'm going to turn off the recording. Anything else you want to say?
No,